Yagalidu, Adam Dunstan Shiiji. As always, I am your professor, Adam Dunstan, and this is Cooking the Anthropology. Today we are going to do somewhat of the sequel to our lecture about a month ago on languages of Dena'ina, Yupik, and Shukpiak people. The topic for today, continuing the theme of this latter part of the course, is language today. Where do indigenous languages in Cook Inlet, in Tikahtnu, stand today? And the answer is that it is a story of both loss, tremendous loss, and also poignant and beautiful revitalization. So that is the topic today. And we will approach it from three angles. First, we are going to talk about what has happened to Alaska Native languages in Tikahtnu over the past 300 years and why. We will talk, secondly, about what is being done to confront this serious issue of language loss. And on point number 3, we will talk about why this matters, why it matters to preserve Alaska Native languages in Cook Inlet, why it is so important not just for Alaska Native communities, but I think also for Cook Inlet residents in general. So that is where we are going today. Part 1 then, what has happened? First off, I want to acknowledge as we start this lecture that talking about language is in many ways a sacred thing, by which I mean something that people hold a certain reverence for, that it is a profound and deeply personal thing for some people, and that it is something that is for many people a stalwart link to their ancestors. At the same time, language can also be for some people a traumatic thing to talk about, a traumatic thing to relearn one's indigenous language that was once the sovereign property of a people, in part because, well, for many reasons, but one being that it is connected to legacies and histories of colonialism, the painful ways in which many of these languages were forced out of the public domain. So with that in mind, we can think of several different ways in which language changed over time. So I have mentioned this before in this class, but as we look at what was happening to languages in the late 1700s and in the 1800s and in the early to mid 1900s, what we see is a displacement of Alaska Native language, in some cases intentionally, in some cases not, in both in a variety of different spheres of language activity. So if we think about what it takes to keep a language alive, what it takes to allow for what we call a language community, a group of people using a language actively, we might think of it as the several different spheres of a society in which that language might be used. And so, for example, we have the sphere of school, of the schooling system. And as we'll talk about in a moment, ultimately Alaska Native languages were completely outlawed within the school system of Alaska in the 1880s. English was the lingua franca, and indeed the enforced language of that schooling system, and continued to be so, and in most cases continues to be the default language for our schooling. In matters of church, people's religious activity, the spiritual domain, although traditional practices and ceremonies did continue, and in some areas have continued for a long time, as many people converted over to Russian Orthodoxy, they found themselves in a church setting, often being exposed to or using Church Slavonic, using languages for that context of Russian Orthodoxy, and then later English in church services. When we look at the business realm, people's jobs, but not just their jobs, but also, going to buy food at the market or whatever, increasingly that was something where Euro-Americans had the predominant financial power, sometimes, as we've talked about, enforced through discriminatory practices, sometimes simply because they were the outside forces bringing in capital and introducing a cash economy. So, although there were obviously exceptions to this that we can point out, many of the business owners and people owning the most capital and running a lot of the businesses were Euro-American and were using predominantly English, or earlier on during the fur trading business under the Russians, Russian. We could think also, so if you think about that, you go to school, you hear English. You go to church, you hear Russian or English, or other church languages that are not Alaska Native languages more often. You go to work and or to the store and you need to use overwhelmingly English. Again, depends on the area. In some of the more rural areas, you could get by just fine using native languages, especially when it was Alaska Native business owners, but especially in more centralized urban areas, definitely needing to use English for business activities. When it comes to entertainment, of course, with a growing film industry, with radio, books, right, all of these sort of ways in which people were consuming entertainment, but that entertainment was overwhelmingly in English, as well as other European languages. And then we can talk also about government, right? You need to pay your taxes. You need to go down to the government office for something. You need to get a hunting permit. You typically needed to do it in English, right? So and earlier than that, of course, in Russian, if you had to interface with the Russian sort of economic monopoly / governance forces. So in all these different ways, you needed to know languages other than Alaska Native languages, and indeed in some cases were actively vilified and penalized, and in some cases abused for using Alaska Native languages. So if we think of a native language community from that perspective, it's sort of being chipped away, partly by attrition, partly by bludgeoning the different domains in which one would use a native language, and so it's being used less and less and less. I mentioned navigation here as a subset of government, although I suppose you could put it under other areas as well. What I'm getting at there is that increasingly, if you wanted to talk to other people in Alaska about, directions of how to get somewhere or where you lived or whatever the case may be, right? We talk about locations all the time in everyday conversation. Increasingly, the names of places were the Russian and then later English names, not the Dena'ina, Yupik, or Alutiiq names. Were there exceptions? You betcha. Places like Tikahtnu, for example, where the place name is the Dena'ina name. And we have many, many other examples we could point to as well, but increasingly it was English terms being used for navigational markers. So over and over and over again, European languages holding space in the spheres where people use language. And as people use that language more and more, that is what they become accustomed to using, that is what they find useful to be using. And so it's not shocking that European languages dominating in all these other areas, sometimes by force, meant that English was increasingly the language used in a final sphere that I haven't mentioned, which is the home. Right? I'm looking at this as a cultural anthropologist, and I'm seeing economy, politics, religion. I'm seeing all those kind of central domains of society, and what I'm not seeing on this list is kinship, the home, the family. And it is the case, certainly, that some communities continued to use it in the home. For example, among Yupik communities, at least, this is a slightly old statistic, but I don't think too old, about 1/4, 17 out of 68 villages still have people learning Yupik in the home, so children learning Yupik. And so, partly for that reason, Central Yupik is what I mean, has, give or take, 10,000 speakers, a lot of speakers. And so, certainly there are still homes, and have been homes, where Alaska Native languages get taught, but increasingly it was English and Russian being taught within the home, and mainly English. And so, because for a lot of different reasons, right? The trauma people go through with an education system that prevented them from speaking their language, people losing proficiency as they fall out of practice, people seeing it as not as necessary for their children to learn the language in a context where they are going to be judged by their ability to speak quote-unquote proper English. And so for all of these reasons and more, language decline happened. Certainly a major factor, one of the most pivotal factors, was certainly the boarding school system, as we've talked about. U.S. boarding schools in Alaska started about 1878, and it was very quickly made the policy that it was English only under Sheldon Jackson, the school administrator. And under that policy, people were often abused physically, mouths washed out with soap, young girls forced to kneel and pray on rock salt if they would speak their native languages in those contexts. It was very much a policy of coerced and forced assimilation in many of the schools. That's also true of language, that's true of language, but also true of clothing and sometimes of spiritual practices as well. I should mention too, to fully understand the impact that boarding schools had, for several decades there was more or less legal control of students. That became a key actual legal issue in more than one court case. But for a time the schools were operating as sort of quasi-guardians of the children, and so a tremendous amount of control where they literally the child had to stay there. The family did not have legal recourse. That was later overturned, but that was the practice for a long time. So huge long-lasting impacts. Among other things, you find yourself with the generational gap, where you have an entire generation or two of people who went through these school systems and that were not using language as much at home, and perhaps their children didn't get it very much, and then we get to a situation now. So it's a tremendous, that is not what that photo is, by the way. I need to remove that incorrect caption. Apologies. This is actually from Dalton, from the teacher Hannah Brees. So that was the situation going as we were extending into the 20th century. So this picture is from 1911, and the boarding schools are still going strong. So we can think about these different factors then in language decline, and it feels strange to sort of systematize this and put scholarly labels on something that's so deeply personal and painful, but it can be helpful to have terms with which to think. The two of the terms that are useful are push and pull factors in language loss or language shift. Push factors are things that push people away from a language, as you might imagine. If you go to a school and you are physically abused for speaking your native language, you are being forced away from using your language. A pull factor is things that draw you into a different language than your native language. So for example, if when you want to buy something you have to speak in English, you need to start learning English, and maybe you start to over time, that tends to be the language you use more often. So the fact that there were English-speaking schools, gaps in language use, media, the business language, all of this led to a decline in Alaska Native languages in many communities. In a sense, among some families, that this was no longer a useful thing, or more often just an inability or a tendency to not speak it as much in the home because of all these forces. It is somewhat challenging and perplexing to note that that was not the situation early on in colonialism. Instead of leading to monolingualism in English, what initially happened was multilingualism in Alaska Native communities, because of the need to both use native language in your own local communities, but also, let's say, Russian while interacting with Russian traders, later English, various Nordic languages, as we had a number of Nordic nation settlers here in South Central Alaska. So, Alan Boris tells this great story of running into this Denina elder one time, and this would have been several decades ago. And, he was talking to a bunch of Russian anthropologists in Russian, and then he switched over to speak in English to talk to Alan. And then he mentioned that he also knew Finnish. And then, of course, he could also speak. Actually, I don't think he was Denina, I think he was Yupik. But the point is that this guy was like quadrilingual, right? And I think he actually mentioned a fifth language that he knew as well. So pretty impressive. I don't know many people that are pentalingual. I knew somebody once that claimed to be decalingual, but I'm pretty sure they weren't being truthful. So being pentalingual, knowing 5 languages, is very impressive. And indeed, many people ended up being multilingual. Indeed, prior to European arrival, many Alaska Native people would have been multilingual, knowing the language of the neighboring group for a variety of reasons, such as Denina people that would speak Ahtna and vice versa. So we faced then a lot of different factors that led to an overall situation of language decline and language slide, and as we now say, an endangered language. What is an endangered language? Well, it's exactly what you would guess based on the term. It's the idea of a language that is in danger of extinction. But you'll notice that we use the same kind of terms that we use for endangered species and extinct species, and it's not entirely inappropriate, although it may sound strange, since language is a living thing. And much like a species can go down very low, but then rebound and come back, it is true likewise with language, and we have a term for that, and it's language revitalization. So we have many languages that are endangered right now, but are undergoing a situation where people are attempting to revitalize them, which we'll talk about in a minute. First, though, let's put this in a bit more of a global perspective. Globally, there are between 6,000 and 7,000 human languages spread across 147 language families. First of all, I want you to sit with that statistic for a minute and be astounded by the linguistic creativity, the cultural creativity, the vast imagination of the human species. Now, having now appreciated that richness, we have another statistic that's very sad, which is that some linguists, and it's impossible to estimate something like this exactly, so this is sort of a back of the napkin kind of math thing, not a precise estimate, but some linguists estimate as much as 50% language is lost by 2100. Saying a language lost, it would be more precise to say that it is lost active communities of speakers, since many languages we have at least recorded in part, many of them only partially, only a little bit. But many we have recorded at least in part, so to say that they're entirely gone might not be accurate, but to say that they are no longer actively in use. So it's predicted 50% extinction by 2100. What does that look like here in North America? On Turtle Island, 72% of Native Americans, according to a 2011 U.S. Census, spoke only English at home. That should actually read Native Americans and Alaska Natives, since those are treated as the same ethnic group within U.S. censuses, generally speaking. And it was found that 15% spoke an indigenous language at home. You'll notice that doesn't add up to 100%, which makes sense, since there would be other kinds of languages being spoken as first languages in some indigenous homes, such as Russian, such as Spanish, depending partly on where you are in the country, and a variety of other factors. Linguistic Society of America estimates that of 300 original Native American languages, which they're talking about US and Canada essentially, that of those 300, 194 persist. That can be broken down further. As you see, they estimate that 25% of those, a quarter, are only spoken by very small numbers of elders. They are highly endangered. Languages like Dena'ina are somewhat in that situation. So Dena'ina, the people that speak it as a first language, are down to about 5 elders. However, there are many people, and it's difficult to estimate the exact number, but if you were to, it'd be definitely dozens, if not hundreds, who have picked up some Dena'ina now in a variety of different ways, or speak it partially, or can understand but not speak, or can understand but not speak, but are now taking languages classes and starting to speak or learning from elders. So anyways, about a quarter, though, of native languages are spoken as a first language, we should say, by a small number of elders. So it's not quite as serious as the statistics suggest, but it is very serious. 38% spoken mainly by adults 50 and over, and then 18% spoken mainly by adults. So you'll note that that adds up to north of 80% are spoken only by adults, not by children. So that's a very serious situation for many of these 200 remaining languages, with 18% spoken by adults and children. These are hard to hear and depressing statistics. Having said that, we should also acknowledge that many indigenous languages of North America have young people who are actively seeking to revitalize the language, or sometimes young adults or middle-aged adults that have taken an active interest in this and are now actively engaged in the work. It's notable, for example, that here with Dena'ina language, as we'll talk about in a minute, some of our main language instructors here on KPC campus, as well as some of the main people working, for example, for Knights Indian Tribe on language issues, are people that are either young people or young to middle-aged adults rather than elders, although we do also have elders in that setting. So, the mantle is being taken up by younger people. Nonetheless, this is a serious situation linguistically for native languages as a whole. Let's get down a little more to fine details. If we talk about Yupik, as I said before, we should say Central Yupik, since we distinguish it from St. Lawrence Yupik, or Siberian Yupik. Central Yupik has about 10,000 speakers. Shukpiaq, a few hundred, about 400. And it is also would be considered an endangered language, although not as highly endangered as Dena'ina, still definitely endangered. There are active efforts to revitalize Alitik or Shukpiaq as well. Among Dena'ina, we have 5 different dialects. So we have, you will often hear people say 4, and that's because many people do not count Soldovia as a unique dialect. Some people do. I always say 5 because I learned this partly from the teachings of Alan Boris, and he would always identify it as 5, counting the Soldovia dialect. A lot of people will say 4. So 4 to 5. The Soldovia dialect you could consider just a very small, almost sub-dialect if you had to. But there's also Upper Inlet. So the area is now known as Anchorage and Matsu, Tikahtnu, these areas. Inland, Outer Inlet, you'll sometimes hear people call that Kenai Peninsula, although that's not entirely accurate because obviously it includes people on this side of the inlet as well. And then Iliamna. Outer Inlet is functionally extinct as a dialect at this point. People definitely still use some of the unique wording from Outer Inlet Dena'ina, and in fact I can right now walk out to Salteshi Trails near where I live and see a bunch of signs that use Outer Inlet Dena'ina words. And again, in many cases the terms are the exact same, but there are subtle differences. Sometimes it's major, like a different word for certain animals, things like that. Other times it's a lot more subtle, a B versus a V, for example, in how certain things are pronounced. So it's more of an accent difference. But Outer Inlet is, at least as a first language, it's something that people speak in the home. We have lost our last first language speakers of Outer Inlet. We do still have, I think Upper Inlet's also in a similar situation, although they do have some. Inland and Iliamna definitely still have a few first language speakers or people that are semi-fluent in it, definitely. And Inland has been traditionally kind of a holdout for the language, partly because of less contact historically with large urban areas with large Euro-American presence. So for example, some of our elders that still speak that are located in places like Lime Village over here, or traditionally grew up in places like Lime Village and Dalton. So as I say, down to about 5 language speakers, and here's a map that shows the 5th dialect or not dialect, depending who you ask of Soldovia Dena'ina. So part of what this teaches me, part of what this tells me, is that the time to learn to speak it is today, right? That it is important that we put resources into preserving the knowledge of elders that speak Dena'ina and of people to take that knowledge on and take that mantle on of learning to speak it in the sense of recording that knowledge, and then ourselves learning to get that language. So that's a little bit about that. I've already covered this language. I put 75 question mark speakers there. Again, about 5 first language speakers, and then it's difficult to estimate how many active speakers we have, so don't take that with an utter degree of seriousness or anything. 400 speakers of Shukpiak, which is roughly 15% of the population, and then in Yupik communities, about 10,000 people. It's about 50% of the people. So it's not insignificant by any stretch, although that should not lull us into a false sense of security. There's a term we sometimes call language shift or language decline. People can start to be using it less or start using simplified versions of it. So we need to be watchful, and so it's still important that Yupik be taught formally in classes, college classes, and things like that, definitely, as a way of reinforcing that. By the way, just as a note on that, this is a map I got from Slate, so who knows if it's actually accurate or not, but it seems reasonably accurate. It's the most commonly spoken language other than English. Not shocking that French here because of Quebec. Notably that I would imagine this map's a few years old. I wouldn't be surprised if Indigenous Hawaiian would now have overtaken Tagalog. Such Tagalog is a Filipino language. And Indigenous Hawaiian is increasingly taught in schools, and it's actually one of our, as you read about in one of your readings, one of our native languages of the United States, where we actually we're producing more more speakers of it per year rather than losing. But anyways, here in Alaska, Yupik is the 2nd most spoken language, surpassing even Inupiaq, which has about 3,000 speakers. And so that's where I want to end this chunk of the video.